the whispering shadows based on true accounts. It all began in the small, secluded town of Blackwood, known for its eerie silence and dense surrounding forests. Hidden deep within this town was an abandoned asylum called Ravenwood Asylum, a place avoided by locals for decades. The asylum was rumored to house not just the ghosts of its former patients, but also something far more sinister, a malevolent force that thrived in darkness. Jack and Emily, urban explorers, fascinated by the paranormal, decided to investigate the asylum. They believed it to be just another haunted location for their growing YouTube channel. Their friend Sam, a skeptic, joined them reluctantly to debunk the myths. They arrived at midnight, the asylum engulfed in a heavy fog. With flashlights in hand, they entered through a broken window. The asylum smelled of decay, and the air was unnaturally cold. Old medical equipment, broken furniture, and graffiti covered the walls. But something was off. It felt as if they were being watched. As they ventured deeper, they heard faint whispers echoing through the empty hallways. At first, they dismissed them as wind passing through cracks in the walls. But the whispers grew louder and began forming words. "Leave. You're not welcome here." Jack laughed nervously, brushing it off as their imagination. Emily, however, felt a cold hand graze her arm, making her scream. When she looked back, there was no one there. Sam, the skeptic, finally admitted he felt uneasy. In one of the rooms, they found patient records scattered across the floor. One file stood out. It belonged to a woman named Margaret Hensley, who had been a nurse at the asylum. According to the records, she had been accused of murdering patients during secret experiments. But instead of being arrested, she mysteriously vanished after the asylum shut down. That's when Jack noticed something horrifying: a mirror in the corner of the room. The reflection showed all three of them, but there was a fourth figure standing behind them, a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. They turned around quickly, but nothing was there. As they moved deeper into the asylum, the shadows seemed to move with them. Doors slammed shut on their own, and their flashlights flickered. Emily noticed scratch marks on the walls, marks that looked fresh, as if someone had just made them. The whispers returned, but now they sounded angry. They heard footsteps behind them, heavy and deliberate. When they turned, they saw a figure, Margaret Hensley. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a terrifying grin. She raised her hand and pointed at Emily. Suddenly, Emily was thrown across the room by an unseen force. Jack and Sam tried to grab her, but the door slammed shut, separating them. Jack and Sam frantically tried to open the door, hearing Emily scream on the other side. When they finally broke through, Emily was gone. All that remained was her flashlight, spinning on the ground. Panicking, they decided to leave, but as they retraced their steps, the asylum seemed to shift. Hallways stretched longer, and doors led to nowhere. The whispers turned into screams, and the shadows became tangible, clawing at them as they ran. Finally, they found an exit, but just as they reached it, Margaret appeared again. She whispered, "You can leave, but you'll never be free." They escaped into the foggy night, but Emily was never found. Months later, Jack and Sam tried to move on, but they were haunted by nightmares of the asylum. Jack claimed he often saw Margaret in his reflection, while Sam reported hearing whispers in his home. One day, Jack received a package with no return address. Inside was Emily's flashlight and a note that read, "She's with us now. You'll be next." Months after the terrifying escape from Ravenwood Asylum, Jack and Sam were shadows of their former selves. Emily's disappearance left an unshakable void, and their once thriving YouTube channel was abandoned. Despite their best efforts, The events of that night haunted them. Literally, Jack began to notice strange occurrences around his apartment. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and every night, at exactly 3 a.m., he heard whispers echoing from the darkest corners of his room. Sam, on the other hand, became a recluse, refusing to speak to anyone. He confided in Jack once, saying he saw Emily in his dreams, but she was no longer the friend they knew. She had become something else. One evening, Jack's laptop turned on by itself. A video file was open, one he had never seen before. The thumbnail was a static image of the asylum, and the file name simply read, Emily's Truth. Hesitant but unable to resist, Jack clicked play. The footage began with the three of them walking into the asylum, but this was not the video they had recorded. The angles were impossibly intimate, as if someone, or something, had been filming them the entire time. The video progressed, showing events they couldn't recall. Emily wandering off alone, speaking to shadows, and laughing maniacally. The final frame was a close-up of her face, pale and lifeless, whispering, "Help me, before it's too late." Shaken to his core, Jack decided to confront Sam, who had isolated himself in his parents' cabin in the woods. When Jack arrived, the cabin was dark, and the door was ajar. Inside, he found Sam scribbling frantic notes on the walls, all of them saying the same thing. "It's watching. It's waiting." Sam turned to Jack, his eyes bloodshot. "We didn't escape, Jack. We never left that asylum. It's inside us now." Sam revealed that he had been researching Ravenwood's history. The asylum wasn't just a place for the mentally ill. It was a site for occult experiments led by none other than Margaret Hensley. She had been trying to bind the spirits of the dead to the living, creating an eternal loop of torment. "She marked Emily first," Sam whispered. "But we're next. That's why the shadows are following us." Jack and Sam realized the only way to stop the curse was to return to the asylum and confront whatever was holding Emily's spirit captive. Armed with salt, iron rods, and an ancient exorcism ritual Sam had found in his research, they set out for Ravenwood one final time. As they approached the asylum, it felt as though the forest itself was alive, branches clawing at them as they made their way through the fog. The asylum loomed ahead, more decrepit than before, yet somehow still pulsing with an unnatural energy. Inside, the air was suffocating. The whispers began immediately, louder and angrier than ever. The walls seemed to bleed, and the floors creaked as if under the weight of invisible footsteps. In the main hall, they found Emily, or what was left of her. She stood in the center of the room, her head tilted unnaturally, her eyes black as coal. Her voice was layered, both hers and something far darker. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her smile twisting into a grotesque grin. "It's too late for me. But maybe, just maybe, you can save yourselves." Before they could respond, the shadows around her coalesced into a towering figure. Margaret Hensley, her hollow eyes glowing red. "You belong to me now," she hissed, her voice echoing like thunder. Sam began chanting the exorcism ritual, his voice trembling. The shadows writhed and screamed, and Margaret lunged at him. Jack fought to keep her at bay with the iron rod, but she was impossibly strong. Emily's voice broke through the chaos. "Finish it," she screamed. "Destroy the mirror in the basement." Realizing the mirror was the source of Margaret's power, Jack sprinted to the basement. The descent felt endless, the stairs creaking under his weight. When he reached the basement, he found the mirror, a massive ornate frame that seemed to pulse with life. Margaret appeared behind him, her reflection in the mirror snarling and clawing at him. Jack smashed the mirror with all his strength. The glass shattered, releasing a deafening scream that shook the entire asylum. As the mirror broke, Margaret and the shadows disintegrated, leaving only silence. Jack and Sam rushed back to the main hall, but Emily was gone. In her place was a small locket, engraved with her initials. They fled the asylum as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the fog. For the first time in months, the whispers were gone. Jack and Sam tried to rebuild their lives, but they were never the same. Jack kept Emily's locket as a reminder of their ordeal, while Sam burned every record of Ravenwood Asylum. Years later, a demolition crew arrived to tear down the asylum. As the first wall came down, workers reported hearing faint whispers and laughter. One worker found a shattered mirror in the rubble, and when he looked into it, he saw not his reflection, but the smiling face of Margaret Hensley. The asylum was gone, but its darkness lived on. Months passed since the destruction of Ravenwood Asylum. Jack and Sam had returned to their normal lives, but something had changed within them. The memories of the asylum, of Emily's disappearance, and of the horrors they had witnessed haunted them every day. Jack had tried to move on, but the nightmares never stopped. Sam, on the other hand, seemed increasingly paranoid. He had taken to wearing protective amulets and surrounding himself with symbols of warding. But the worst was yet to come. It started with small things. A door left ajar, even though they were sure they had closed it. The strange, fleeting shadows that seemed to follow their every move. Sam noticed that every time he looked in a mirror, it felt like something was watching him from the reflection. The whispers, though faint, began to return. They were always there, just out of earshot, like the wind brushing against the back of his neck. One night, while Jack was staying at Sam's cabin to help him sort through old things, they both heard a soft knock at the door. But when they opened it, no one was there. Only a small, weathered box sat on the doorstep. Inside the box was a single item, a photograph of Emily, taken in the asylum before her disappearance. She was standing in front of the shattered mirror, smiling. The photo looked old, yet there was something off about it. It had no date, no photographer's name, just the haunting image of her grinning face. But it was what was written on the back that chilled them to the bone. "You can't escape me. I will always find you." Jack and Sam both agreed that they had to go back to Ravenwood. Something had followed them, and it was clear that Emily's spirit, or whatever had taken her, was not at rest. As they made their way back to the now demolished asylum site, the air grew heavy. The fog rolled in thick, and the temperature dropped unnaturally. It was as though the land itself was calling to them, drawing them back to the place of their nightmares. When they arrived, they found that the site had been abandoned, yet there was something unsettlingly familiar about it. The foundation was still intact, and part of the old building's structure remained, standing like a half-sunken skeleton in the fog. But the most disturbing thing was the faint hum in the air, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Then, as if by some twisted magic, the asylum began to rebuild itself before their eyes. Walls rose from the ground, windows shattered into place, and the door creaked open. It was as if Ravenwood was calling them home. Inside the asylum, nothing had changed. The same crumbling walls, the same oppressive silence. But this time, it felt different. The shadows seemed darker, thicker, and more alive. Jack could feel them watching him, circling him as if waiting for the right moment to strike. They went straight for the basement, knowing that if the mirror was still there, they had to destroy it once and for all. But when they arrived, the basement was empty. The mirror was gone. Instead, in the center of the room, there was a single chair, facing a wall. The whispers grew louder, echoing around them. "Sit," they said. "It's time." Reluctantly, Sam sat in the chair. The moment he did, the shadows came alive. They twisted and turned, wrapping around his body like tendrils, pulling him into a trance. Jack tried to pull him out of the chair, but it was as if Sam was glued to it. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his body convulsed. Then through his lips, a voice that was not his own spoke. "It's too late, Sam. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." The voice belonged to Emily, but it was distorted, malevolent. Suddenly the ground beneath them began to shake. The asylum around them groaned as if waking from a long slumber. The walls cracked open, revealing hidden chambers and forgotten rooms. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and death. From the cracks in the walls, figures began to emerge, twisted, contorted shapes that seemed to be made of shadow and mist. They were the souls of those who had perished within Ravenwood, the victims of Margaret Hensley's dark experiments. And among them, the most terrifying figure of all, Margaret herself. Her eyes burned with a crimson glow, and her twisted smile stretched impossibly wide. "You've come to end me, haven't you?" Margaret hissed. "But you've already lost." With a wave of her hand, the room darkened, and a storm of violent shadows swirled around them. Sam screamed in agony as the darkness consumed him, his body writhing in the chair. The whispers turned into a cacophony of screams, and Jack could feel himself being pulled into the darkness. Jack knew he had only one chance to save Sam and himself. He rushed toward the chair, trying to break the hold the shadows had on him. With every ounce of strength, Jack grabbed the iron rod from earlier and thrust it into the darkness surrounding Sam. The shadows screamed in fury, but they recoiled, giving Jack a brief moment to act. He grabbed Sam and pulled him out of the chair, but the struggle wasn't over. Margaret's shadow form lunged at them, her claws tearing at the air. Jack realized the key to ending this once and for all wasn't just destroying the mirror, it was breaking Margaret's hold over the asylum. As he searched the room in desperation, he spotted an old weathered book lying on the ground. It was an ancient occult text, the very one Margaret had used to bind the souls of the asylum's victims. Jack grabbed it and began to chant the ritual written within, his voice shaking but growing stronger. Margaret shrieked, but her form began to dissipate as the shadows around them melted away. The walls of Ravenwood began to crumble, the asylum collapsing in on itself as the cursed spirits were freed. As the asylum collapsed, Jack and Sam made it out just in time. The fog cleared, and the sun finally rose. The land was quiet again. But as they stood there, watching the ruins of Ravenwood vanish beneath the earth, they heard one last whisper. "Remember me." Emily's voice, distant and fading, was the last thing they heard before the wind carried it away. Even though Jack and Sam thought they had escaped the horrors of Ravenwood Asylum, the peace they sought was fleeting. In the months following the collapse of the asylum, strange things began to happen to them both. Though they had parted ways after the traumatic events, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. It seemed as though Ravenwood's dark influence had never truly ended. Jack had returned to his apartment, trying to rebuild his life and career, but he could never escape the sensation of eyes lingering on him. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing whispers that sounded far too familiar. Meanwhile, Sam had become reclusive, staying in his cabin and refusing contact with anyone. The isolation did little to ease his growing fear. Then came the phone call that neither of them expected. It was late one evening when Jack received a package at his doorstep. He didn't recognize the return address. Inside, wrapped carefully in an old cloth, was the same photograph of Emily that had appeared at Sam's cabin months ago. This time, however, there was a new addition, a second figure, standing beside Emily in the reflection of the shattered mirror. The figure was a man, tall, thin, and faceless. His body was twisted, as if he were composed of shadows and darkness. At the bottom of the photograph was a single word written in blood-red ink: "They're coming." Jack's heart raced. This wasn't just a random photograph. It was a message, one that had to do with the dark force still lingering from Ravenwood. Jack immediately called Sam, but there was no answer. He called again, and this time, Sam picked up. His voice was raspy, almost unrecognizable. "I knew it," Sam said, his words trembling. "It's not over. It never was." "What do you mean? What's happening?" Jack asked, panic creeping into his voice. "The Shadow Man," Sam whispered. "He was always there, hiding in the darkness, waiting. He's the one who helped Margaret trap Emily, and now he's coming for us." Jack didn't need to ask any more questions. He knew what Sam meant. The Shadow Man, the figure in the photograph, was not just a manifestation of the curse. He was something far worse, something tied to the very essence of Ravenwood Asylum. The dark force that had taken Emily's soul had not been vanquished with the asylum's collapse. It had merely bided its time. Despite the warnings, Jack knew that there was only one way to end this once and for all. He and Sam had to confront the Shadow Man at the place where it all began, at the ruins of Ravenwood. When they arrived, they found that the land was empty, the foundation of the asylum still eerily quiet, but there was something unsettling in the air. A low hum, as though the ground itself were alive, vibrating with a dark energy. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, they felt the temperature drop. The shadows grew longer, more pronounced, and then the whispers began again, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder, echoing in their minds. "Come closer," they beckoned. "You have not learned the truth." The air thickened, and suddenly a dark figure materialized before them, the Shadow Man. His form flickered like a dying flame, and his face remained blank, a shifting mass of darkness with no distinguishing features. But his presence was suffocating, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You think you've defeated the curse?" The Shadow Man's voice echoed, its tone distant yet all-encompassing. "But you've only released it. You've allowed it to grow stronger, to feed on your fear. Emily is mine, and now so are you." In an instant, the world around them seemed to collapse. The ground cracked open, and the sky above turned dark. The ruins of Ravenwood warped and twisted, becoming an endless maze of corridors and doors leading nowhere. Jack and Sam were trapped, their movements restricted by invisible forces. The Shadow Man reached out, his hand moving like liquid darkness. As it touched Jack's arm, a cold wave of terror swept through him. He saw visions of Emily, tortured and trapped in a world between the living and the dead. But worse still, he saw the Shadow Man's true nature, a being born of pure darkness, a creature that had existed long before Ravenwood was built. The asylum had merely been its prison. "You cannot escape me," the Shadow Man said. "I was never confined. You cannot break what was never meant to be broken." Desperate, Sam recalled the ancient text they had used to destroy Margaret. He knew it held the key to breaking the curse once and for all, but only if they could perform the ritual correctly. He began chanting the incantations from the book, his voice shaking with fear and exhaustion. As he spoke, the ground beneath them trembled. The Shadow Man screeched, its form distorting, writhing in pain. But just as Sam was about to complete the ritual, the Shadow Man reached out with tendrils of darkness, pulling the book from Sam's hands. "No!" Sam cried out, but it was too late. The book was gone, consumed by the void. The Shadow Man's form swelled, becoming an enormous, towering figure of pure darkness. "You will serve me," the Shadow Man hissed, his voice an amalgamation of countless tortured souls. "You will never be free." In a final act of defiance, Jack grabbed the locket that Emily had left behind, her only remaining token, and threw it into the darkness. As it passed through the void, the locket began to glow with a faint, ethereal light. The glow from the locket intensified, and the Shadow Man screamed in agony. The light from the locket pushed back the darkness, forcing it to unravel. The ground beneath them began to crack open, and the entire realm of shadows started to collapse. "You cannot take her," Jack shouted, his voice filled with raw emotion. "She is free." The locket's light exploded in a burst of radiant energy, consuming the Shadow Man in its brilliance. As the light surged through the ruins, the Shadow Man's form shattered into a million pieces, dissipating into the air like smoke. But before it vanished entirely, Jack saw something. The faint image of Emily, smiling one last time before she was lost to the light. The ruins of Ravenwood Asylum fell silent. The darkness that had plagued them for so long was gone, and the land felt lighter, as if the curse had finally been broken. But Jack and Sam knew that their lives would never be the same. The trauma of the events they had endured would stay with them forever. They left Ravenwood behind, never to speak of it again. But in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees, they would sometimes hear a faint whisper, "Remember me." And they would know that some stories, some curses, never truly end. The darkness may have been defeated, but the memories of Ravenwood lived on. Jack and Sam moved forward with their lives, but they would never forget the horrors they faced, and the one thing they learned: the shadows are always watching.